Well, a very big good afternoon and a welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our inaugural Health Matters webinar series. My name is Karen Inch and I'm going to be your facilitator or MC for the day, and it gives me great pleasure to do so. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we find ourselves today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be participating in this webinar today. Now, today's program is going to be one of great interest to all of us. And it's a presentation on bipolar disorder from Professor Michael Berk, followed by a short presentation from SVI's Dr. John Scott. After the presentations, we will have a short Q&A where you will have the opportunity to write questions to either Professor Berk or Dr. Scott. And there's a Q&A button on the bar at the bottom of your screen. I know many of you are already familiar with that. So feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar. And we will only be using the Q&A feature today rather than the chat or the hand up. So we will attempt to get through all your questions, but if we don't, well, I'm sure there'll be another way of getting those questions answered afterwards. So feel free to, I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of questions. So it gives me incredible pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Berk to you. He's amazing. He's the NHMRC Senior Principal Research Fellow and is the Alfred Deakin Chair of Psychiatry at Deakin University and Barwon Health, where he heads IMPACT, which is the Institute for Mental and Physical Health and Clinical Translation. But on the bibliometric resource expertscape, and I looked that up, and that means that he's cited and published more than anyone else in the world, because he's ranked #1 in psychiatry globally. And if we dig a little deeper, so become more specific, but in depression and bipolar disorder, Michael is ranked #2 globally and first in Australia, which is, so we have definitely somebody who knows what they're talking about here today. So nationally, between 2014 and 2019, Professor Berk was the top ranked author in citations in Australia for the FOR code Psychology and Cognitive Sciences, and 11th globally. He's the past president of the International Society for Bipolar Disorders and the Australasian Society for Bipolar and Depressive Disorders. He is listed by Thomson Reuters as amongst the world's most influential scientific minds. Now, wouldn't you love that title? It's absolutely amazing. And was awarded the Brain and Behaviour Colvin Award for Mood Disorders in 2015, Victoria Prize for Life Sciences in 2019, the International Society for Bipolar Disorders Bob Post Award for Mentorship in 2021, and the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists Senior Research Award in 2021. And Michael has also attracted, I think, $79 million worth of funding for his research. We are very privileged to have you speak with us today, Professor Berk. So the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the invitation and for that very generous introduction. It's my pleasure to talk to you about bipolar disorder, which is a condition I basically have spent most of my life researching. So let me summarize what I'm going to tell you about. So I'm going to tell you a few things, 4 things. #1, it's a complex disorder. #2, it's probably one of the most neglected top 10 causes of disability. And I think it is the most neglected top 10 global cause of disability. Thirdly, it's one of the worst treated conditions out there. And fourthly, there's some really exciting stuff going on that has the potential to really make a big advance in terms of how we're managing this disorder. So there is a lot of hope and a lot of optimism in terms of what we're going to be doing. So that's kind of the start of where we want to go. So let me just give you an idea of where we're at in terms of the global treatment development landscape. So each of these little dots is a study. And if you look at bipolar disorder here, there was a fair amount of activity in the 2000s, in 2010. But if you're looking what's happening in the last 5 or 10 years, it's almost nothing. There's almost no global pharmaceutical industry development in this disorder, which is incredibly disappointing. If you look at global health funding, here you can see bipolar disorder right at the bottom of the pile in terms of the extent to which it attracts funding for research. This is global funding. And if we look at Australian funding, so this is data from the International Alliance of Mental Health Research Funders. And here you can see bipolar disorder languishing at the back of the peloton with a relatively paltry amount of support. So what is bipolar disorder? Well, bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, but it's essentially a disorder of energy. It has 2 poles, mania and depression. And there are a couple of types of bipolar disorder. So type 1 bipolar disorder is characterized, if you look at the purple, by major highs and major lows. Type 2 bipolar disorder has little highs and big lows. And those are the 2 major forms of the disorder. Mania is the hallmark of the disorder. It's characterized by inflated mood, increased energy, decreased need for sleep, talkativeness, and impulsive behavior that occurs in the context of mania. And depression is subtly different in ordinary depression to bipolar disorder. I'll come to that, but it's characterized by low mood, slowing of movement, sadness, hopelessness, loss of interest, changes in sleep and appetite, and often suicide. Tragically, it has a disturbingly high suicide rate. There are very few FDA-approved treatments for the disorder, and most of the treatments that we have are much better for mania than depression. Depression is the major unmet need in the disorder. There are many causes of bipolar disorder. So there's a genetic link in the disorder, and the genes that are involved in the disorder are involved in things like changes in neural signaling, the glutamate system, hormones. There's a very important role of environmental factors like trauma, substance abuse, drugs, and stress. This leads to changes in the neuron, changes in the circuitry of the brain, and this leads to changes in behavior and mood symptoms and energy. And the ultimate impact of this is impairment in functioning and quality of life for people who struggle with this illness. You can look at separate depression and bipolar disorder. In depression, you don't see mania or hypermania. Mania can be sometimes caused by medical conditions like a traumatic brain injury or tumors or hormone conditions. Very commonly, it looks like amphetamine or other stimulant intoxication. So those are important differential diagnoses. There's a condition called cyclothymic disorder, which is a variant of bipolar disorder where people have mild highs and mild lows that don't meet the severity or the duration thresholds. There's also an overlap between some of the psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. A big area of confusion is borderline personality, where there's a lot of instability of relationships, self-image, and mood. People with borderline personality differ in that they're very impulsive and they have fears of abandonment. But very frequent misdiagnosis between borderline personality disorder and occasionally narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. But the big overlap is really borderline personality disorder. So if a clinician sees somebody who's struggling with depression, there are some clinical clues that make you worry that this is more likely to be depression in bipolar disorder than unipolar disorder. So sleep is a big one. When people get depressed with bipolar disorder, there's a tendency to increased sleep. In unipolar or regular depression, there's decreased sleep. Bipolars tend to overeat. People with unipolars tend to lose appetite. There's much more slowing of movement and thought in bipolar disorder. Psychosis is more common in bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder tends to occur earlier, the peak age of onset is 17, and it often has multiple prior episodes. Unipolar depression tends to begin a bit later, usually peak age is about 25. And often you do get a family history of bipolar disorder in people with bipolar disorder. But the truth is that that's not a strong differentiating factor. Bipolar disorder also is commonly comorbid with other medical disorders and psychiatric disorders. So medically, commonly you see migraine, pain, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. Psychiatrically, a lot of overlap with personality disorders, attention deficit disorder, anxiety, eating disorders, and substance abuse. So I'm going to just show you something about treatment patterns in the disorder. Let me preface this slide and the next slide by saying that the treatment recommendations say, and all the guidelines will say the same thing, thou shalt use mood stabilizers to treat this disorder. And the second law on the second tablet that came down off the mountain says, thou shalt not use antidepressants. So what are we seeing here? So in red is any mood stabilizer. So rates 20 years ago were 60%. They're now down to about 30% of rates of mood stabilizer. So 30% of people are doing the right thing. Rates of lithium use have gone from 35% down to about 15%. And I'll tell you, lithium is still the best treatment we've got. Rates of antipsychotic use has gone from about 10% to about 55%. So that's very high use, driven by a lot of marketing activity by the drug companies. But the most worrying thing is antidepressants. All the evidence tells you you should not be using antidepressants for this disorder, unless in exceptional circumstances. So rates of any antidepressant use have gone up from about 45% to about 65%. So the most common therapy in bipolar disorder is a therapy that most guidelines tell you not to use. And the first line therapy that all the guidelines tell you to use, lithium and other mood stabilizers, is used in a very small percentage of the population. In other words, this is a treatment that in the real world gets shocking care, sadly. So one of the things I was asked is to share you some resources. There are a lot of resources out there for people with bipolar disorder. Much of this is very high quality. So there are local resources on Beyond Blue, Black Dog, Mental Illness Foundation, Mental Illness Fellowship, Mind. We've got our own website, which gives information for caregivers called bipolarcaregivers.org. And we have a psychotherapy, which is on moodswings.net.au. It's on mothballs for funding reasons. There are a number of really good books that teach you about it. Mental health first aid is useful, and there's some very useful caregiver organizations. In the second half of my presentation, I really want to tell you a little bit about the work that we are doing to try and discover new treatments for the disorder. And John will be sharing very similar information. And I'm going to also weirdly show you some synergies and concordances between the work that we're doing. So in general, if you're trying to discover a new treatment, the highway, the intellectual pure way, is you have a clear pathophysiology that leads to a single clear target. We really haven't had much of that to date, although John, I think, is going to show you some very interesting work. The second way that you can target treatments is to look for a system or a network. And we've been very interested in looking at inflammation, oxidative stress, mitochondrial function, and neurogenesis, or the growth of new neurons. And there are a lot of drugs that we've been developing in our unit that targets these pathways. But the truth of the matter is most of the drugs that we have in use really come from clinical observations or just serendipitous findings that suggest that an old drug that's in use for another indication might be of use in bipolar disorder. And the truth is that almost every drug that we use every day comes from this pathway. But there must be a better way. And we're very interested in repurposing drugs based on reverse engineering. And I'll explain a little bit later how we reverse engineer other drugs to see if they're useful for bipolar disorder. So we and others have developed validated models for repurposing existing safe and tolerable medications. Now we know that drug repurposing is really a pragmatic way that might help the field revitalize after a drought. And in truth, we really are in a drought. At least 30% of the recent drugs approved by FDA are repurposed. And this is well established as a drug discovery platform for cancer, immune disorders, diabetes. It's much quicker, cheaper, because we know the drugs, they're generally known, off-patent, generic, cheap, and generally safe. So this is the platform that we have developed. What we have developed really a bench to bedside paradigm for how we can repurpose new drugs for bipolar disorder. So we start with the stem cell model. So we use stem cells and we use gene expression. So we look at what genes get turned on by other drugs and in the disorder, and we use this to discover new drugs. We then go to animal models where we can see, do these drugs that we have identified have antidepressant or anti-manic effects? We can then go to epidemiology and look at the use of drugs in the community and say, if you take these drugs, do you have a lower or greater risk of developing the disorders? And then we can go to clinical trials. And in the trials, we can look at biomarkers that go back to the mechanisms that we've discovered. So this is our blue sky vision. This is what we've tried to develop in our team. So our goals are to develop new treatments, to minimize side effects, and really to follow precision health approaches to match effective treatments to individual patients. So as I said, we go from epidemiology, animal models, through to clinical trials with the aim of dissemination and implementation in the real world. So how did we begin in this field? Well, a group in our unit decided to do a very crazy thing. They took single nucleotide polymorphism, so that's gene variants, and they looked at available data, in this case, the Wellcome Trust data. And on the top here, you can see bipolar disorder, and the identified genes are the little green dots right at the top of the line. They looked at those dots, and with a mathematical model using in silico, so no test tubes got wet in this process, they were able to match this to compound libraries to see what drugs fit these genes as you can see them. And they came up with two candidates. The one, believe it or not, imipramine, an old antidepressant. So that's really interesting. If you come up with an antidepressant to target a mood disorder, that's interesting. And the other one they came up was valsartan, which is an angiotensin drug. Angiotensin, it's a blood pressure medicine, widely used. We know these drugs are safe, but what the hell has this got to do with bipolar disorder? We paid no attention to this, but we carried on looking. And we've been talking to our diabetes colleagues who came up with a fantastic model. So they were able, in diabetes, to use this gene expression model where they look at what the anti-diabetic drugs do to gene expression. They then were able to look at what other drugs do the same as known diabetes drugs, and they came up with a drug called methazolamide. They went to animal models, and they were able to show in animal models that methazolamide reduces sugar. And they were then able to take this into clinical trials and show that methazolamide treats diabetes. So it's a brilliant study where they were able to go from stem cells in diabetes through to clinical trials and develop a new drug for diabetes. This was the most exciting thing I had seen in years, and I was able to persuade the lead scientist, Ken Walder, to move to the dark side and start studying bipolar disorder, and he did. So this is what we're doing now. We take people with bipolar disorder, we take their blood cells, we reprogram these to induce pluripotent stem cells. We grow these stem cells in the lab, and we turn them into cortical networks. So this is mixtures of neurons and glia. And we think it's critical to choose the right cell, because if you don't get the right cell, you risk getting the wrong signal. What we do then is we take known bipolar medicines, in this case, lithium, lamotrigine, valproate, quetiapine. We look at gene expression to see what genes these combinations of drugs suppress or stimulate. We do fancy maths, and I don't do this fancy maths, and we come up with this gene expression signature. To validate this, we give rats the same cocktail to see if they do the same thing. And we also take white cells from patients with bipolar disorder to see if we get the same gene expression signature. We then do drug screening, and we identify drugs that behave the same way as known drugs that we know are effective. And that allows us to repurpose drugs for bipolar disorder. So what do we find? So let me start at the bottom of the line, which is a calcium drug, cinnarizine. And I thought, John, this kind of ties into the work that John's doing, which identifies calcium signaling as critical to the disorder. The second drug we come up with is flupentixol, which is an antipsychotic, which is a known treatment for bipolar disorder. So whenever you come up in an theoretical screening with a known treatment, that gives you a bit of confidence that you're on the right track. But most interestingly, we come up with another angiotensin drug. So this is a blood pressure drug. It has anti-stress signaling properties. It also works on dopamine in the brain and other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and serotonin. We also come up with a COX inhibitor, and there's quite a lot of work out there showing that COX inhibitors have potential for a lot of psychiatric disorders. And we come up with a couple of cancer drugs, and I don't know what they're doing. While we were doing this, more recently, another group was looking at major depression and used a very similar paradigm to what we're doing. So they're looking at genes in pathways associated with depression, and they're looking at drugs that impact these genes, and they use mathematical enrichment pathways to develop candidate drugs. And what do they come up with? They also come up with an angiotensin drug, as well as a whole lot of other things. Many of those are already areas of interest. So 3 different atheoretical screening paradigms all are coming up with angiotensin drugs. So we were able to partner with colleagues in Texas who've got an animal model in mania. And what we did in our animal model of mania, we used an amphetamine model of mania. So if you give rats amphetamine, they get hyperactive. You can see this tall black bar. And whether you use lithium or other doses of candesartan, which is the angiotensin drug we're interested in, we show that it reverses mania. We've done the same in depression, and we're able to show that we're able to reduce depression in this model. And most interestingly, when we look at people with hypertension, we were able to show that if you take an angiotensin drug compared to any other blood pressure drug, you have a much lowered risk of developing depression. So we then were able to go to epidemiology studies and show a dramatically reduced risk for developing depression if you take an angiotensin drug compared to people who don't. Lastly, we went to look at the literature on randomized controlled trials of angiotensin drugs, and we were able to show improved quality of life, well-being, and reduced anxiety. And this allowed us to go on to grant applications and commence clinical trials of candesartan for bipolar disorder. So we are now, we've been able to go from stem cells to clinical trials. So let me finish at this point in time, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you have about any aspect of the work that we're doing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was very, very interesting. And we're going to take the question and answers at the end after John's presentation. So please, everybody, just write your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll take your questions at the end. So thank you very much for that overview. And now I'd like to introduce SVI's own Dr. John Scott. He is the head of SVI's Neurometabolism Lab, and Dr. Scott graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Honours from the University of Glasgow, hence you'll hear his accent, and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Dundee, funded by the prestigious Wellcome Trust Prize Scholarship. He moved to Melbourne in 2006 to undertake postdoc studies at SVI. Dr. Scott also holds a research-only senior academic fellow appointment at the Mary MacKillop Institute of Health Research at ACU, and is a senior honorary research fellow of the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. And John is going to talk to us about some of the work that he's doing in his lab at SVI. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for the kind invite to present some of our research today. Let's get this up. Okay, thank you. So today I'm just going to let you know about some of the research we're doing, kind of along the same lines as what Michael alluded to earlier. So it's all about looking for new treatments to treat bipolar disorder. So the road that sort of led me to study bipolar disorder is from a slightly different angle from Michael. So Michael obviously has a very long interest in the psychiatric aspects of bipolar disorder. But my foray into bipolar disorder more or less came from fascination to understand why a psychiatric illness like bipolar disorder actually has profound metabolic phenotypes. So patients who present with bipolar disorder often have metabolic defects, and there's some of them here. Things like impaired glucose and fat metabolism. As Michael mentioned, they have impaired appetite control, and they can often cycle between weight loss and weight gain. And I think redefining our view of bipolar as both a psychiatric and a metabolic disorder is really key to kind of unlocking the causes of bipolar disorder, because it helps narrow down the search for causative agents, because it has to be something that not only controls behavior, but also controls metabolism. So for the last few years, my team has been studying a molecular switch called CampK2, which controls mood and whole body metabolism. So CampK is found in the brain, and in particular neurons. So neurons are like the electrical signaling cells in the brain. And what they do is they transmit signals across the brain to control like their behavior and moods and a whole load of different aspects of physiology. And within these neurons, there's a whole array of molecular switches, and CampK2 is one of them. And what these switches do is process these electrical signals. And what CampK2 does is it controls behavior, it controls cognition, also controls our appetite, and it also regulates body weight by telling our bodies whether to burn or store fat and sugars. And it also controls memory. And generally, this all happens when CampK2 is switched on. However, we found that CampK2 can be switched off, particularly by a drug called methamphetamine, which is otherwise known as ICE, and also genetic mutations that are found in patients with bipolar disorder. So these factors can switch CampK2 off. And because it controls metabolism and behavior, we think it's an excellent candidate as a drug target for bipolar disorder. And we were particularly intrigued by this effect of methamphetamine because methamphetamine abuse actually kind of mimics bipolar disorder. So as Michael mentioned earlier, patients with bipolar disorder tend to swing in and out of different moods. So they can go through a sort of mania phase where they're sort of deluded, hyperactive, and then also swing into these long depressive periods where they have suicidal ideation and things like that. And methamphetamine abuse causes very similar effects in humans. So during the sort of high phase of methamphetamine use, folk tend to be euphoric, have delusions. They also have decreased appetite and low blood glucose. However, during the withdrawal period, they tend to go into depression. And you can see here, this kind of mimics the kind of effects of bipolar disorder. And so we took advantage of this observation we made that methamphetamine can switch CampK2 off. And we actually identified the part of CampK2 that methamphetamine actually impacts. And we took advantage of this to generate some mice. So we genetically engineered some mice where CampK2 is either switched on all the time or switched off. And these mice have been created and we're just about to start testing them. And what we predict will happen is that when CampK2 is switched on, these mice will display normal behavior, but they'll be resistant to methamphetamine, so they won't have all the behavioral effects of methamphetamine. And we also predict they'll display normal behavior, normal metabolism. However, in the mice where CampK2 is switched off all the time, we expect these mice to develop behaviors that are similar to human bipolar disorder and methamphetamine abuse. And we also expect them to have impaired metabolism, so changes in appetite, body weight, and glucose and fat metabolism. Now, we're pretty confident we're going to see these effects because I'll just show you here. These are neurons. So the neurons, like I mentioned earlier, are the electrical stimulating cell, the cells that pass electrical signals in the brain. And this is what a normal neuron would look like. And so this is a neuron here imaged by fluorescence microscopy. And this is from a brain cell where CampK2 is switched on all the time. You can see it looks pretty normal. It looks like a normal brain cells. So this is the cell body here, a long axon, which you can see here, and then the dendrites down the bottom here. However, on the neurons from mice where CAMPK2 is switched off, it doesn't really look like a normal neuron at all. You don't have these long axons. You can see the axon is very, very short. So we fully expect to see some sort of behavioral change, which is pretty exciting. So these experiments will basically confirm whether and provide as close as you can to definitive proof that CAMPK is a major player in bipolar disorder. So if CAMPK2 is switched off in human bipolar disorder, how do you switch it on? And so the good news is that we've identified a new class of drug that can switch CAMPK2 on. So it's called ETC1002. So we identified that with some of our colleagues in Canada. And we're just about to start trials of this drug in mice. So Jacqueline Kaiser, who's a PhD student who recently joined the lab, she's about to get started. And just a shout out to the donors who support Jacqueline's top-up scholarship award. So, and the other good news is that ETC1002 is already FDA approved to treat another metabolic disorder. So if Jacqueline can prove that it has mood stabilizing effects in mice, then we can rapidly move to human clinical trials. And this is where Michael would come in, because then we could move pretty quickly towards human translation. Okay, and that's the end of my presentation. And thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John. And now it's over to our audience. If you would like to ask your questions, just go to the Q&A section at the base of your screen and type in your questions, and we will attempt to answer them. Well, I won't, but the others will. So the first question really relates to the animal models. And John, I'll ask you this question. How accurate are the animal models used for bipolar disorder?
Fairly accurate. So some of the tests that are performed in the mice are actually same tests that are used in humans. So for example, one of the tests of psychosis is very, very similar to the test that's used in humans. So there's a sort of cross-species validation there. Obviously, some of the other tests have to be modeled. So things like hyperactivity are pretty easy to measure. You know, the mice will tend to run around and, you know, no time to sit, chilling out. And yeah, things like that are fairly standard. I guess some of the more complex behaviors are a bit more difficult to model in mice.
So,
would you like to say add to that, Michael?
Yeah, so John is absolutely correct. So the methamphetamine model is a widely used and accepted model of particularly of mania and withdrawal in terms of depression. We've been working with colleagues at a number of different universities, UQ and the Mayo, to develop a deep brain stimulation based model of bipolar disorder, where we use deep brain stimulation, where we go into the nucleus accumbens, stimulate the brain, and then so we stimulate the neurocircuitry that drives mood regulation, and we can create something that looks a bit like mania and something that looks a bit like depression. So there's still work going on to this, but this, we hope, will come up with a animal model that looks like the actual phenotype of the disorder and uses the circuitry of the disorder. It's still in development, but I think there's a need for refined animal models, but it's work in progress.
Absolutely.
Okay, lovely comment. Thank you. Very interesting talks. And this is for Professor Berk. Have there been any recent advances in the non-pharmaceutical treatment of bipolar? Is there reason for hope here?
There absolutely is reason for hope here. So when we talk about the non-pharmaceutical treatments, I would break them into two. The one is the psychotherapy, and the second is the lifestyle approaches. Compared to the amount of work that's gone in depression, where literally many hundreds, if not thousands, of clinical trials have been done on psychotherapy for depression, there are literally a handful in bipolar disorder. So there's 2 or 3 studies of cognitive behavior therapy. Some say that it works. The biggest doesn't say that it works. I think there are problems with that study methodologically. There's a therapy called interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, which might be useful. Family-based therapies are almost certainly likely to be useful, and psychoeducation is likely to be useful. We've been working in our team to develop group-based therapies. So David Castle, actually originally at St. Vincent's, developed the MAPS model, and we've been working to refine this, and we've now turned this into a hybrid therapy with group-based as well as internet support elements. So we're finalizing this, and we hope to roll this out throughout our clinical partners. So the MAPS program is run throughout the Health Scope and I think the Ramsay Hospital Stable. And we hope that the new one, which is called Bipolar Wise, will be rolled out as well. We're working on developing a caregiver support app, which is called bipolarcaregivers.org. So this is currently available on the web. So this is a free resource providing support to family members, loved ones who have somebody who's got the disorder and don't know quite what to do with it. So it's like an owner's manual. The other really hot area is lifestyle therapies. So these are things like nutrition, optimal diet, physical activity, minimization of substance abuse, and normalization of sleep. So those 4 lifestyle elements are now rapidly taking foreground attention, and there's a lot of work going into validating the right way to do lifestyle modification. But I think most clinicians accept that this is a very important element in the management of the disorder.
Another question for you, Michael. Has the link between bipolar disorder and creativity been definitely proven? And if so, why would this exist?
Well, that is a brilliant question. So there is definitely a link between creativity and bipolar disorder. Bipolars are amongst the most creative people out there. And if you look at who's vulnerable to get bipolar disorder, there's a brilliant English study which looked at who developed bipolar disorder. But if they looked at kids and they looked at how smart they were. The kids who were the smartest in their class had a tripled risk of developing bipolar disorder. So it attacks the brightest and the most intelligent. And it's kind of one of the things about evolution is, why does this persist? And it's because a little bit of it gives you a survival advantage. It makes you more reactive, more creative, more out there, more likely to take risks, and more likely to thrive and survive. But too much of it triggers pathways, and John's working on some very exciting pathways, which will explain why a little bit of it gets out of control and makes you unwell.
Well, John, a question for you. Is there any idea how lithium works mechanistically, and why not, if it works, why not stick with this treatment?
Well, there's lithium actually stimulates CAMPK2, but the problem with lithium is it's the dose, the effective dose, the therapeutic dose is very close to the toxic dose. So, and there tends to be a lot of off-target effects. So because it's a salt, it affects the kidneys, and it can be pretty toxic. Maybe Michael want to make a comment on that too.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with lithium is not that it doesn't work. The problem is that its tolerability is not great. So it's got side effects, particularly long-term side effects like on the kidney, which can cause problems for people. It's not the easiest drug to manage because it needs regular blood levels, and people are attracted to the more convenient alternatives, which in my view aren't as effective. The other problem with lithium is that if you don't start it early enough, and if you wait until the person's had dozens of episodes, it doesn't work as well. So it works beautifully early on in the course of the illness. It doesn't work as well if a person's been left too long. So we need alternatives.
Well, you we've got a lot of questions, so we'll see what we can get through. But Professor Berk, you referenced the power of the pharmaceutical industry. How can patients be sure that drugs that are prescribed are actually effective and not just well marketed?
That's a really important point. Well, one of the side effects of the fact that we no longer have a pipeline of new drugs is there's no drug companies coming out to market anymore. So most jobbing clinicians are not seeing drug reps because there are almost no new drugs that drug companies are selling. However, the impact of their marketing campaigns remains. So I think that clinicians need to be guided by the global guidelines for the management of the disorder. And if I can shout out the best, I think are the Canadian guidelines. They're called the CANMAT guidelines, and they are, I think, the most authoritative. But there's also World Federation of Societies of Biological Psychiatry. There's Australian College guidelines. If you follow any of the guidelines, you'll do a lot. You'll be treating your patients well.
Is there a link between CAMKK2 and some of the potential therapeutics identified by Professor Berk, including lifestyle changes, nutrition, and exercise? So this one's for you, John.
Absolutely, yeah. So the particularly the lifestyle and the diet. So omega-3 fatty acids, which is obviously Felice Jacka has done a lot of stuff on that to do with depression. So they switch CAMPK2 on as well. And in fact, that drug that I talked about at the end, that's an omega-3 fat mimetic.
Is CTA, it's a different language for me, is CTA -1002 similar to Candastatin, is that correct, or some other known drug?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up.
So do you know what that is? Have I got it?
I think it might be one of the statins. So the reason that drug was developed was for folk who couldn't take, where statins are ineffective to lower cholesterol.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Not sure about that. Okay. How do you find a clinician who knows anything about bipolar?
Oh boy, now that is a tough question. Usually the network, you speak to consumer support groups and they will tell you there are doctors who have a particular interest in the disorder. There are many in Melbourne I know of who are very, very good at treating the disorder, and the network will tell you.
Yeah. There's another question. Is there any correlation between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder and their treatments?
A very complicated question. There's no doubt that the symptoms of the two problems they overlap. There's no question that there are higher rates of borderline personality in people diagnosed with bipolar and vice versa. They're not always easy to tease apart. In my view, the treatments don't overlap that much. People use drugs like atypical antipsychotics and some anticonvulsants for borderline personality disorder, where their benefits are fairly modest. Most medicines are not that useful for borderline personality. The psychotherapies are by far the most effective treatment. But saying that, the therapies for borderline personality like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, are actually quite useful for bipolar disorder. But it's not, it's not always easy to tease these apart, and often pictures can evolve over time.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we'll have to leave it there. So I'd like to thank all of our attendees for their wonderful questions, but I'd really also like to thank Professor Berk and Dr. Scott for their very wonderful presentations and insightful. I mean, it's a really complex disorder, and one that I think has touched a lot of people in our community. So it's great to get a brief overview and some insights into the research and the hope that we'll be seeing in the future. I think that's a wonderful thing about research, and that it presents so much hope. So thank you very much, Professor Berk and John. And just to finish off, I mean, it's if you'd like to learn anything more about what we're doing at SVI, please feel free to reach out to us. It's also tax time, so without doing a bit of a sales pitch, you've heard from John about the work that he's doing. We'd love your support. We need a lot of support. And so if you'd like to make a donation or a gift to us to support John's research, please head to our website, and there's plenty of ways in which you'll see the little icon donate to be able to certainly make a donation. And so thank you very much, both of our speakers, and thank you to all our attendees. Wonderful news that we'll be out of lockdown sort of by the end of the week. Yes. So that will all help with our mood disorders and all the difficulties in our mental health issues that we're facing. So thank you once again. Enjoy your afternoon, and we'll look forward to perhaps seeing you at our next Health Matters. Thank you.